Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Danny Wicentowski, in for Elaine Shaw. The National Personnel Records Center covers more than 7 acres in St. Louis County. It is a massive building, a fortress, and it is the home of something the government has spent its entire existence trying to protect: millions of military records. But here in St. Louis, on July 12, 1973, those records burned.
Deputy Chief, go ahead. Deputy, I was sitting over here with the ladder. We got a major fire on the 6th floor. Major. You want another ladder truck?
On that date, the building's top floor was consumed in fire, and without a modern sprinkler system, it burned until its very structure buckled and broke. 22 hours passed as firefighters battled an inferno that, in the end, changed American history by destroying it. An estimated 16 to 18 million records were lost in the fire, a staggering amount even today. The U.S. Army alone lost 80% of its records between 1912 and 1960. That's World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. The 1973 fire in St. Louis is considered the single largest destruction of federal records in the history of the U.S. government. This year, the National Archives is commemorating the 50th anniversary of the fire. It's a moment of reflection for the agency, and its employees are still working to reconstruct the records that survived that fire all those years ago. Today, we're going to explore the legacy of that fire and the ways that this single incident changed America and the mission of its record keepers. Now, the fire didn't just touch the lives of archivists, of course. There were members of the military whose records and files were destroyed forever. And to get an idea of what that means, let's consider the lost records of a particular Army sergeant who served in World War II. His name was Irvin Isidore Sadowski. I knew Irvin Sadowski as my grandfather Irv. And that's where I want to start our story, on a recent visit I took to the National Archives Record Center near Spanish Lake. I've come with a mission to find what is left of my grandfather's military records. Now, visitors to the National Archives are forbidden from bringing in anything that could mark a precious original record. And so, after passing through a security check, I begin my search for my grandfather with archive specialist Eric Kilgore. Eric takes me to a research room arranged with banks of microfilm readers, and behind them are rows upon rows of filing cabinets. Eric brings me to a research table and to a very large book.
This is a canvas-covered bound book, similar to like a 3-ring binder, but instead of rings, this has posts that go through the ends. These things have a lot of good information in them, especially in cases that, like with Irvin's record, which was lost in the fire, we can get a really good snapshot of his service from this book.
This ledger is the first step in our search for my grandfather's records. Its pages list the names of the men drafted in his hometown, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in 1942.
Okay, here we go. All right, so right there we've got Irvin Isidore Sadowski, and then it's got his age as 18, white. Date that his questionnaire was mailed. So the Selective Service Board mailed his questionnaire out on December 7th, 1942, so a year exactly after Pearl Harbor.
It's right there on the page in front of me. My 18-year-old grandfather's careful capital letters and spidery cursive. It's amazing to see, but I can't help but think there should be so much more. Eric has already given me the bad news. Irvin Sadowski's military records were completely destroyed in 1973. There are no backups. But that destruction only accounted for his official personnel file. There were other sets of files in other facilities, in places spared by the flames. Some of those records are digitized, and some of those are in the ledger in front of us. It's Eric's job to find those pieces and how they fit together
So if we had any of his original documents, like when he was discharged, he would have been given a separation document that had his time in service, when he went in, when he got out, his character of discharge, what his military occupational specialty was. That document's kind of a snapshot of his entire service. So since we don't have that, we've got to kind of dig a little bit more through these other alternate sources to figure that information out.
It hurts to know that I'll never truly get to see those details about my grandfather's service in World War II. Instead, the task now is all about those alternate sources, and Eric has already found some.
We knew that his record was indeed destroyed in the fire, and all that we had was that final pay voucher that basically squared his pay account when he was discharged from the Army.
A pay voucher doesn't sound like much, but it's a promising start for our search.
So when you requested his record, we knew that we had this pay voucher. One of the things that we look for is to try and find a unit that they served with. That's really important because sometimes when people come in and all we have is this final pay voucher and we show a separation center, we can get on the morning reports for that separation center because we know the date that they were discharged, but it's kind of the proverbial needle in the haystack when you're looking through all of those names to try and find one individual.
Lucky for me, Eric is an expert at finding needles. Our next haystack is a set of World War II records that are called morning reports. Those reports list the names and activities connected to particular units.
The way to think about this is kind of like a point of sale system, an inventory tracking system for soldiers.
Now at this point, we're done with the ledger and its hundreds of handwritten names. In the search for my grandfather, it's time to use a different tool. Microfilm.
All photographed decades ago. So this is kind of the natural next step. Once we've looked at all of the auxiliary information that we might have, the final pay voucher, selective service stuff, we've got his unit information. So we know we got paid in June of 1944 by the 62nd General Hospital. So we're going to look at that tape and find him on the tape.
Looking through microfilm is tedious work. A single turn of the dial sends dozens of names scrolling by, and there are thousands more. Eric tells me that some researchers can spend days doing this.
If a soldier moved around a lot to lots of different units, it can be a lot of research. You can literally spend hours upon hours doing this.
Eric scrolls through the microfilm morning reports. But there's still no sign of my grandfather, Ervin Sadowski.
So we know at this point he's enlisted, so he's not going to be a lieutenant or a captain or anything like that. So when we start seeing enlisted ranks like sergeant, corporal, private first class, that's where we want to start looking for him. And we just kind of go through these, and you can see how this could be very time consuming because you're basically at this point you're looking, just kind of scanning these names looking for a Sadowski.
The search continues, and after a few more minutes we do find what we came for. On the screen in front of us, in white letters on black, is my grandfather's name.
All right, you see him?
Yeah.
Okay,
I see him.
So this here is Office of the Detachment Commander, 62nd General Hospital, APO 350, which at this point is in Ullinwood in England. And so we know at this point, in June of 1944, he's a clerk typist with the 62nd General Hospital in England. So it was not too long after this that the 62nd relocated to France. Well after D-Day, when the beachhead was established and the invasion was going well. But from this point, we know on June 23rd, 1944, he's right here with this unit.
And that's where he stayed, until he too joined the millions of American service members leaving Europe by 1946. I still wish I knew more about my grandfather's official military records, but I did learn new things about him. I learned that Ervin Sadowski served his country as a typist in the U.S. Army, and in France, he was part of the monumental administrative task of wrapping up the war and sending soldiers home. I've seen pictures of my Grandpa Irv's time in World War II. Black and white photos of the Eiffel Tower, the army tent he shared with 5 other men, even pictures of himself a 19-year-old kid in a uniform, far from home, and part of something so big and so important. Irvin Sadowski passed away about 13 years ago when I was 20 years old. I don't remember ever asking him directly about his time in World War II. Everything I've known has come from my parents, my grandmother, and the photos and records he left behind. His full record, the complete story of his Army service, the 1973 fire means that's gone forever. But even if what's left are just pieces, I still feel closer to him. There's something special in seeing his name in documents the government has held onto for more than 80 years, even if, 50 years ago, that same government failed to protect them from the flames. That fire has its own story, and the people who risked their safety to fight it didn't just save lives, they saved tens of millions of records that might have otherwise been destroyed. And coming up next, we'll explore that fire and why it raged so fiercely. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome back. Not long after midnight, on July 12, 1973, an alert began sounding across the fire departments in North County, St. Louis. A fire had broken out in the Military Personnel Record Center in Overland, the building that housed the country's vast and precious collection of military records, each one recorded on paper, each irreplaceable, and each so flammable. The fire would consume the 6th floor, and the efforts to fight it would take multiple crews, hundreds of men, and it would leave what's still considered the single greatest destruction of federal records in the history of our government. That fire has touched a lot of people's lives, and understanding what it was like to fight it, that's an interest that our next guest has had for a long time. Captain David Dubowski is a fire captain in North St. Louis County, and he joins us now. Captain Dubowski, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So, Captain Dubowski, you've been documenting the history of the 1973 fire for some time. You've written about it extensively. What first drew you to this incident?
My love of the fire service, specifically the history of the fire service in St. Louis County, has always been a passion to me. I've been in the fire department for about 40 years now, and the older I get, the more sentimental I get about the stories of the past that need to be shared to future generations of firefighters. This fire at the Record Center, which is 50 years ago now, it's still considered the greatest fire, the largest fire in St. Louis County.
Wow. Tell us how this started. Again, this is July 12, 1973, and this fire kind of starts, not much with a bang, but just, it doesn't seem so bad at first. Take us into that night. Who first reported it?
There was a gentleman leaving his business in Olivet, which was just a few blocks away from the Record Center. The man had a motorcycle, and as he was getting on his motorcycle, he noticed fire coming from the top floor of the Record Center. So he told his boss to call the fire department. As he jumped on his motorcycle, he drove himself over to the Record Center, where he saw a guard that was standing at the gate. He informed the guard of the fire. So the first two reports actually came from the same individual.
Wow. And so the guard at the Record Center just had no idea his building was on fire?
Absolutely none. There was no inkling, no anything that a fire was going on. There was no alarm system in the building up on these floors at that time, which would give early indication that there was a fire.
Okay, let's take a pause there, because the lack of alarm system is part of just one of the astonishing pieces of this, is that this huge building with so many precious resources did not have a sprinkler system or an alarm system in the way that we now, I think, take for granted. How did that happen?
Well, it was a government building. Basically, that's what it comes down to, and it all was a matter of cost. And the cost to sprinkler this building was going to be enormous. But at the same time, the number one fear of the archivist in the building was of water damage. Their second thought was, well, a fire was never going to happen here. But there was a more prevalent possibility that if a water pipe would break, then several of their records and archives would be damaged.
Now, one other piece of this, the variable that keeps coming up when I read about this, is just the sheer size of this building and the way that these records were stored. looking back, it almost looks like a perfect recipe to give a fire the most space and the most oxygen. What else about this building is notable in the way that it was a really great place for a big fire to start?
Yes, just the size, the enormity of it. The original way that the files were stored, well, after about a decade or so, that went by the wayside. And then the files basically were just stored on open metal shelves in cardboard boxes. It just was a recipe for disaster.
This is not a small office building. This is something that is, multiple city blocks long. When that fire breaks out, what are the first firefighters? What scene do they come to? Or is it really bad at first, or does it seem like something that could be handled by the local crews?
Yeah, so once again, the fire was, reported just after midnight. Obviously, it's dark outside. The Community Fire District, which takes care of Overland and several of the other smaller jurisdictions in North St. Louis County, they got the call. So they responded with about four or five, 6 pieces of fire equipment to the scene. They pulled up to the front gate. Now, the original caller, which obviously was the same person, had saw the fire on the 6th floor. Fire was coming out of the 6th floor windows. By the time the community fire department had arrived on the scene, the story had changed. Now the guard was reporting to the firefighters that were first arriving on the scene that there was a fire in a 4th floor restroom. So that was their original call, was a 4th floor restroom fire. And the way that they came in, they were not facing where the flames were coming out. So any of the firefighters, none of them saw the fire on the way in. And even as they entered the building, there were no signs of that fire just because they were on the totally opposite side of the building.
How did they get so turned around?
Well, they weren't turned around, but it was just like you said, the size, the huge size of this building here was just so big. And it's, like you said, it's football fields and football fields and football fields stacked on top of each other, which made up the size of this building. If you put it in the city, it would probably be a good city or 2 block long building. Mm-hmm. So the way that they were dispatched, the way they came down into the fire, they just never saw it.
And what do we know about what was happening in that 6th floor? I read some reports that the heat was so intense that the masks were melting on the faces of these firefighters, and they had to retreat.
Correct. And you have to remember, 50 years ago, the technology for firefighters' personal protective equipment is not what it is today. Basically, a firefighter, when he got on the job, was handed a rubber coat, a rubber pair of boots, an old fire helmet, and some rubber gloves. And an enormous amount of files that were burning by the time the firefighters reached the top floor, and the amount of heat that was being produced was basically melting these rubber coats and these rubber gloves that the firefighters were wearing.
Wow, that must have been terrifying for the firefighters themselves, and they had to keep going in there.
These guys were hardcore. We talk about the old firefighters that are around, back in the day. They're old salts. They didn't have the technology that we have now to keep ourselves. They went in and they did their job, and that's what these guys were sent to do. They, received a report of a fire, and they went to put it out, and that was their goal.
Wow. And eventually, the fire crews did attempt to get to the 6th floor. They did identify that as where that fire was. And one of those firefighters was a guy named Greg Silliman. He was a captain with the Hazelwood Fire Department. And in an oral history conducted by the National Archives, he described what it was like to try to get to that 6th floor.
The door was extremely hot. Once we got the door open, there was, I would say, 5 or 6 inches of water on the floor, and the water was scalding hot. And that water started coming out at us and cascading down the stairwell, and it just instantly filled that stairwell up with smoke and steam. And let me tell you, that steam was hot, and it was just intolerable. So we had to abandon our plans and go back down to the ground level.
Captain Dubowski, this scene that he's describing, boiling hot water and an uncontrolled fire, how did that scene get produced? Where did that water come from?
So as the original firefighters made their way up, they made their way up to the 4th floor for that report of a bathroom on fire. They got to the 4th floor, and there was really nothing much going on. Maybe an odor of smoke, maybe some light smoke in the building, but not anything to say that there's a fire on the 4th floor. So as they made it up to the 5th floor, The smoke was a little bit heavier. Something's going on up here, but still, there was not a lot of heat up here on the 5th floor. So that is when the crews made it up to the 6th floor, which is the top floor of the building. And that's when they had heavy heat, heavy smoke conditions, and they knew that the 6th floor was where the fire was burning.
We're talking today about a massive fire in St. Louis that in 1973 destroyed 16 to 18 million military records. And we're reflecting on the legacy of that fire 50 years later. We're talking with Captain Dave Dubowski. He is a fire captain in North St. Louis County. Now, the main firefighting activity, from my understanding, this would take another 20 or so hours of this fire burning out of control. And one thing that I was really struck by, both in the oral history accounts and your own writing, was the lack of ladder trucks, just the ability to get tall enough to get those hoses to the 6th floor. And this it required cooperation and input from other fire departments. And that was not common at the time. Is that right?
That's correct. And the way St. Louis County was then and still is, there are currently 42 separate fire agencies in St. Louis County. 50 years ago, there was probably about 45 or 46. So a small department, such as what is set up in St. Louis County, cannot handle a major incident. Luckily, we have a mutual aid plan in St. Louis County to where any large-scale incidents, several different fire departments, come to the scene and assist each other. Now, the big difference back then is there was no mutual aid policy between the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County. Today, we have that policy where companies from the St. Louis County can respond into the city companies can respond in the county. 50 years ago, there was none of that. And like you said, there was a shortage of ladder trucks in St. Louis County to be able to reach that 6th floor. So the decision was made day 2 that they needed a 100-foot ladder truck from St. Louis City. The dispatcher in St. Louis County called the dispatcher in St. Louis City and was told, I can't do that.
Wow.
So they had to call the fire chief of the city of St. Louis and wake him up and ask him for permission for that 100-foot ladder truck. He told them, I can't do that. You have to call and wake the mayor up. So finally, they called the mayor of the city of St. Louis sometime after midnight, and he gave his permission for a ladder truck just to respond out to the county for a fire.
And it really did seem remarkable to the firefighters on the ground that there was this, a regional response. And Greg Silliman, again, he was the former Hazelwood captain who responded to the 1973 fire. He himself was also among those who were called in to help with the additional manpower, the additional equipment, and give relief to those. And he described just what it felt like to be part of something so big.
And I noticed when I got up on top of the 85-foot ladder truck that you could see fire from one end of that building to the other. When we went to this fire and saw what was involved, we all knew that this was probably the biggest fire that we would ever see in our career. And I just wanted to do all that I could to be a part of it and to help out and help the guys that were the initial responders.
That was again Greg Silliman, former fire captain in Hazelwood, talking about responding to the 1973 fire at the Military Personnel Records Center. And Captain Dubowski, it struck me that Greg Silliman's recollection of that moment of the St. Louis City fire trucks coming in and the additional ladders, he was not expecting that at all. Did that change something about the way that the city and county cooperated after this fire?
Absolutely not. It took another 15 years before there was a mutual aid policy between the city and county. This was a one-time thing, and that's why all these county firemen that were at the scene, they were astounded to see that St. Louis City hook and ladder truck show up. They'd never seen it before, and they would never see it again for another 15 years.
Wow. And I guess there wasn't another big fire like that either.
Correct.
In total, this was a fire that took 5 days, and I've seen the numbers of 381 firefighters to fight. It burned out of control for 22 hours, but there were still fires going through that weekend. This seems almost unmanageable. How does that strike you now, looking back?
Very impressive, just for the fact that 50 years ago, there was not the incident command system that we go by today in the fire service. Our incident command system that we use here in St. Louis is based on the huge wildland fires from California. That's where it came from. 50 years ago, there was none of that. To me, what these guys did was phenomenal, just for the fact that They got together, they came up with a plan. If plan A didn't work, they went to plan B. Plan B didn't work, they went to plan C. And they got it. They got it, and by doing that, they saved a whole lot of military records.
One of the most remarkable moments of this incident is actually, again, has to do with the 6th floor, and it's actually the removal of that floor, which is just an unbelievable engineering aspect. Talk to us about what happened to that floor and what happened when it began to break because of the fire.
So I guess it was probably day 2 into the fire. They were starting to, some of the fire chiefs were starting to see scenes of a possible collapse of the top floor. The concrete pillars were starting to shift and such. And due to the leadership of the fire chiefs that day, they pulled everybody out of the building. All firefighters were told to evacuate the building and get out. Shortly after that, a very big section of the concrete roof collapsed into the building. If there would have been firefighters inside, there would have been several, dead firefighters that day. Luckily, that did not happen.
And that was actually a somewhat good thing, in quotes, for that collapse to happen. I understand it allowed the building to vent?
Correct. If you think about a chimney, the smoke, the heat goes up out of your fireplace. That's what happened here. There became a huge hole was in the roof, and a lot of the heat, a lot of the smoke, a lot of the gases that were in there that had no place to go, all of a sudden had a place to escape, and then that brought down the temperature on that 6th floor, and that made it easier for firefighters to get inside and finally extinguish that fire.
Captain Dubowski, it's still just, as a layman, a non-firefighter, hard to imagine what it would be like to go into that building. You have one floor that is consumed in flame. There is so much water that there is 6 inches of standing water on some of these floors. The water is boiling hot. There's steam everywhere. When you look back at the accounts of some of these firefighters, what do they say about how they got through it?
They did their job. I mean, guys back then, they were making, minimum wage. Firefighters were every firefighter back then had 2 or 3 jobs just because they were making so, low wages and everything. So these guys were doing it because that was their job. They weren't high-priced, people just out doing something for the money. These were guys that had a calling. They were firefighters. They were sent to the scene, and they did their job.
Mm-hmm. Captain Dubowski, you actually teach the history of the fire services here, in the region to St. Louis City firefighters?
St. Louis County Fire Academy, yes.
Do you tell this story to them?
Yes, we share this story. We share the stories of several major fires that have occurred across the country, but we really home in on the Record Center fire just because it is such a historical fire here in St. Louis County.
What lessons does it teach the firefighters of today?
Well, I guess it teaches how far we've come, with our technology, with everything going on. It's possible for this to happen again. I mean, there are still major fires that occur. There are still major fires that occur in St. Louis County, in the country, where several people die. And you would think with all the technology that's out there, all the fire suppression systems, things wouldn't happen like this, but things still do happen, and we have to be prepared for them.
Do you think this kind of fire could ever happen again?
Oh, I definitely do. I mean, you see fires across the country where a Home Depot burns down right in the middle of the day. How does this happen? Well, then you hear that maybe the sprinkler system had gotten turned off, inadvertently the day before or something like that. Stuff happens.
I guess finally, you've spent so much time kind of talking with the people who were part of this incident. You've reconstructed the individual calls down to the minute. It's incredible how much documentation there is of the, which specific fire crew called for this at what time. What stands out to you about this event 50 years later?
That not many people know about it. I think a lot of veterans know about it just for the fact of so many files were lost and so many families have tried to get records. It's very impressive that the National Personnel Record Center still has a team dedicated to trying to, fix some of these burn records. But as far as the fire service side of it, we really need to be prepared for major events like this. Major events are low frequency but very high risk.
Is there a part of you that wonders or wishes that you could have fought this fire?
Well, that's a tough question. We stay pretty busy in North St. Louis County. We have those calls that we call career calls, where it's once-in-a-lifetime calls. If we would have been there, my generation of firefighters back then 50 years ago, it would have been a career call for us. And I'm sure 50 years later, we'd still be talking about it.
Captain David Dubowski is a fire captain in North St. Louis County. Captain Dubowski, thank you so much for joining us today.
It was a pleasure, and thanks for allowing me to share this story.
Now, we aren't quite done yet with Captain David Dubowski. A day after our interview, I realized that I had forgotten to ask him something pretty important, so I gave him a call.
Hello?
Captain Dubowski?
Yes.
Hey, this is Danny at St. Louis Public Radio.
I'm glad I answered because for whatever reason it came up as a spam call.
Oh, well, that is funny. So this is not spam, but I do feel a little regretful for taking up more of your time. So I forgot to ask you something. I forgot to ask about the cause of this fire on July 12th, 1973.
Yes.
Am I understanding right that we still don't know?
That is correct. To this day, 50 years later, there has never been an arrest, and there has never been an official determination of the cause of the fire.
Help me understand this, because you mentioned that there had been previous fires, things in the custodial closets. There's theories about electrical shorts, and the FBI appears to have really seriously considered arson as a cause for this. What are some of the main theories, I guess, for this fire?
Yes, from May 1972 until the major fire on July of 1973, there were 9 other fires reported at the Record Center. Of those 9 fires, 7 were in restrooms. 1 was in a trash container. The other was a mop fire on a 5th floor custodial closet, which occurred just 6 days before the major fire. Of these 9 fires, 6 were suspected of being intentionally set and were investigated by the FBI.
And yet they could not make any connections between those fires and the big one?
You are correct. It was agreed that the situation was dire and that all possible means should be taken to identify the person or persons who had been setting the fire. There was a letter that was drafted to everybody that was in the building looking for a lead, maybe to apprehend the suspect. Unfortunately, there was insufficient evidence, and because of that, there was nothing ever done.
Dave, tell me about the custodian that I read about who admitted in October of 1973 to smoking in the file room. This someone confessed to some level of negligence. Can you tell me about what happened to that custodian and why that didn't turn into anything solid?
Obviously, this time, early 1970s, there was a lot going on, the Vietnam War, civil unrest, racial unrest. It was just tumultuous times, obviously, in the United States. Several conspiracy theories came out of this. At the same time, smoking was allowed in the building. It was accepted in the 1970s. And there were other reports of small fires being reported by someone smoking. They did have a suspect. Once again, no one was ever arrested, but there was a suspect that basically they thought did it. But he was never prosecuted, and in the research that I've been doing, have never been able to identify exactly what went on. But there were other conspiracy theories as well about, besides the fact that maybe somebody intentionally set the fire, was it a government conspiracy to cover up certain records? Was it somebody protesting the government that, maybe set it on fire? Intentional, or was it simply an accident by someone smoking a cigarette and then just discharging it into the wrong place, and that's how the fire started?
So of those conspiracy theories you just mentioned, is there one that intrigues you the most?
Obviously, 50 years later, looking back, it'd be nice to say, hey, obviously this was the cause or that was the cause. There was so much damage to that 6th floor that when the arson investigators came in and the federal agents came in, they just could not pinpoint even a certain location to where that fire started. Conspiracy theories obviously are always fun, looking back, but once again, we'll just never know what happened.
If you had to identify the most likely possibility, the most likely cause for this fire, what would you put that as?
Back in those days, smoking was the cause of so many fires across America. Most fire fatalities back then started as smoking. It would be safe to say smoking obviously was allowed in the building. It would be safe to say that smoking was a possible cause of it.
Captain David Dubowski, fire captain in North St. Louis County, thank you again for talking to us about this case.
My pleasure. It's always enjoyable to talk about this fire. It intrigues me, and 50 years later, I'm sure it's intriguing to a lot of other folks as well.
Coming up next, we'll talk to the historian of the National Archives, and we'll learn about the aftermath of the 1973 fire and how its impacts are still felt today. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome back. I'm Danny Wicentowski in for Elaine Cha. We're talking today about the 50th anniversary of a massive fire that destroyed millions of military records right here in St. Louis. The 1973 fire changed how our government treats these records, but it also changed how the public accesses and relates to them. A half-century later, the National Archives is marking the anniversary, but it's also telling the story of what happened after the flames. And to tell that story and to talk about why the National Archives is putting a spotlight on one of its most devastating incidents, we have Jessie Kratz, the historian of the National Archives, on the line. Jessie, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Thanks for having me.
And also with me here in studio is archive specialist Eric Kilgore. Eric, welcome to the show.
Hi, Danny. Thanks for having me.
Jessie, I wanted to start with you. You are the historian of the National Archives, and you are telling the story of this institution. Why is this fire important to that story?
Well, I think it's really important for people to understand that the National Archives didn't just give up after the fire and say, well, those records are burned. They don't exist anymore. So as representatives from the federal government, staff felt that it was their obligation to veterans and their families to do everything they could. And since the fire, staff has undertaken a massive amount of work to make sure these veterans' records are available. And now we're making sure the extent of that work is captured and shared, and that our staff's efforts are acknowledged.
Now, Jessie, you and your team have been really leading this effort to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the fire. The National Archives website has a bunch of new resources, pages and retrospectives, but this was an incident that involved so many people, so many years, so many different divisions. Where do you even start in trying to go back as a historian to commemorate it?
Well, so we were always planning on doing a commemoration, and we started to compile a list of names of staff and former staff who really wanted to participate in this. And we just started interviewing. And, with each interview, we asked staff who they could recommend, and we kept talking to people. And eventually, we transcribed these interviews and put them online. And so we're still commemorating it. And if anyone else wants to come forward and tell their story, we're available to do just that.
Right. And Jessie, I wanted to take a step back and ask Eric something about when the military records, when we're talking about these records, I think a lot of people could imagine very different things, what someone fills out when they enlist, maybe letters they wrote back, maybe their pay stubs. But we're talking about the loss of 16 to 18 million records in this single fire. And so, Eric, if you could just help us understand, when we're talking about records in the military, what are we talking about?
So the bulk of the records that were affected by the fire were the official military personnel files. Every service person who enlists in the military would have one, and it's basically a complete record of their service. So any of the when they enlisted, their enlistment contract, any of the administrative things that you would have throughout a person's service, pay, disciplinary, promotions, things like that, as well as the most important document, which is the notice of separation. There's a few different forms depending on the branch of service, but it's the precursor of today's DD 214.
Right, and it's still just, to ground us in this loss of these millions of records, we're talking about, every personnel discharge between November 1st, 1912 to 1960. And that's just the Army. In the Air Force, we're talking about September 25th, 1947 to January 1st, 1964. Help us understand, for these individuals, what does that loss of those records mean? What do they no longer have access to? And what complications in their life does that create?
Immediately when the fire occurred and these records were destroyed, the most important thing was verifying service. So if an individual needed a benefit or entitlement, we had to have a way to show that they did indeed serve and they served and were discharged honorably. And that's kind of where this whole story starts.
Let's take us to the aftermath. The photos of this are just incredible. The entire top floor of the building is gone, and there's a kind of tent city and system to get the records out, figure out what's there. So, Jessie, set this scene for us. What does the National Archives look like in the aftermath of this fire?
Well, it was really, GSA and the National Personnel Record Center or the Military Personnel Record Center and their staff. And they had to not only contend with, the fire, the damage to the building, but the records themselves. And they did everything that they could to stop the damage of the fires. That you mentioned the tent city and segregating the records out and freeze drying some. And it was just the beginning of a very long process to save as many records as possible. And then, of course, in the weeks and the months that followed, the mold that would inevitably grow on these records. But we began servicing records that same year. So it was, even though it was a major fire that destroyed all these records, we got back to work almost immediately trying to service these records for these veterans.
Eric, talk a bit about that effort to preserve those records. Jessie just mentioned freeze drying them, concerns about mold. I mean, what were the practical impacts of dealing with records that had both been burned and maybe soaked in water?
So immediately after the fire, recovery efforts began. And with a fire of that magnitude, there was millions and millions of gallons of water that were poured onto that sixth floor. And that water eventually made its way down through ducts and stairs and things like that to other levels. So beyond the records that were affected by the fire, more records had to deal with water damage and things like that. And anybody that's been in St. Louis in July understands the heat and humidity, and almost immediately they started finding mold growing on those records. So one of the things that they did, they shipped some of the records off, but McDonnell Douglas actually brought in a freight car to the tracks behind the facility, and they actually started freeze drying records to try and kill or at least prevent that mold growth. All of the records that, the entire sixth floor, as you mentioned, was a complete loss and it doesn't exist today. They ended up removing the entire sixth floor. But during that process, the ceiling had caved in. All the remaining records or portions of records that were up there had to be taken out of the building, stabilized. Some went to those freeze drying, but they literally had a tent city in the parking lot of that facility over there, records staged in milk crates to try and help dry them out. And eventually what you saw over time was all of those records or portions of records that were able to be recovered out of the building were meticulously cataloged. So at this point today and soon after, they knew what they had, but they didn't know what they didn't have.
Jessie, this process of restoring and recovering these records, this took years and years and became a very long-running program that was dealing with the effect of this fire, and it really changed how the government looked at storing its files and, my understanding, how they built the new National Archives Center in St. Louis. So take us through that. How did that 73 fire change how the government looked at records, period?
So before, it wasn't common to have sprinklers in the buildings. Some did, some didn't. We, had to have professional standards created, follow these standards, make sure people weren't smoking in the buildings, which people did, and a lot of these fires were caused by smoking, and just putting everything into place. Our buildings, the building that these records were in was designed for storage, but it was basically a warehouse, giant rooms, so not so good for fire prevention. Now we design rooms with smaller, bays, not giant open spaces. So if a fire were to start, it wouldn't spread to the next room.
Mm-hmm. Now, one other big change, of course, that happened is that the facility in St. Louis, had to be changed. A new one was built, a very large, very expensive, purpose-built structure that I got to visit. And Eric, that's where you get to work every day, and that you've been there for more than 10 years. What is that building like, and does it reflect the lessons of what happened in 73?
Most definitely. To this day, when we talk about the fire, it's something that happened 50 years ago, but everybody that works at that facility still deals with the fire every single day. It's a part of all of our, daily lives. The records that survived the fire, in large part, are in cold storage in that facility in the same condition that they were taken out of the building in 1973. So in any time a veteran or their next of kin, or, they file a request for any type of benefits, that nowadays, especially with our World War II and even our Korean vets, a lot of those are for like final military honors and things like that. Those files have to be pulled out of cold storage. We've got a state-of-the-art preservation facility within that building that's, purpose-built to be able to handle the challenges of fire-related, mold-contaminated records to help those veterans. But I actually had the opportunity to work at our old facility, and it's night and day difference. Even as far down to the climate-controlled facility. There was no air conditioning in the stacks at Page. The windows could open, birds could get in there. And when Jessie referred back to when we built that facility, Congress actually mandated that the National Archives house all of these permanent records and up to certain archival standards that just didn't exist back in the in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So it's a huge difference. As she mentioned, there's fire breaks, smaller bays, things are more compartmentalized. We have state-of-the-art fire suppression systems. So as the saying goes, lessons were definitely learned and applied to the construction of this new facility.
We've mentioned the loss of the records themselves, these 16 to 18 million records in total. There are also what's known as a B file, a burned file. And Eric, I'd love if you could tell us, what that is and how do you make a burn file? Is it what's left, or are you pulling together from what's still available?
So we've got a couple things when we're talking about fire-related records. So all of the B files that exist are records that either survived or portions of records that survived the fire in 1973. The range of damage is, you see everything from a charred document with a corner with a legible service number on it to a completely pristine record. So all of those, when we talked about after the fire, all of those records were, collected and cataloged. That's in our modern day computer system, our registry. All of those are in there.
I guess, Jessie, I'm curious, lastly, will we ever be done reckoning with this fire? Will the work around these documents and the reaction to what happened, is that just going to be ongoing forever?
I do think so. I mean, we're still dealing with the aftermath of the 1921, Commerce Department fire that destroyed the census, and that's, the 1890 census was much longer ago. So no, I don't think we're ever going to be able to get over it, but we're continuing to find new ways to, fill the holes in the official record. So I'm confident that even though we may never get over it, we will be doing the best we can to make sure, no veteran is negatively affected because of this fire.
And Eric, do you agree? Is this story still ongoing?
Most definitely. If you think about the National Archives, like the facility here in St. Louis, we have records pretty much of anybody who served in the military or civilian service for the 20th century. But the National Archives holds records back to the Revolutionary War, and there's still an interest in those records, in the American public. So even though the direct access needed by veterans, of these records will pass just as those of Revolutionary War and 1812 and Civil War veterans, there's always going to be that interest, and we owe it to the American public to make those records available to the best of our ability.
Eric Kilgore is an archive specialist at the National Archives, and Jessie Kratz is the historian of the National Archives. Jessie, Eric, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
This episode was produced by Danny Wicentowski.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.